I'd like to introduce briefly Mohamed Tal, our speaker today. Mohamed is a experienced practicing Lacanian psychoanalyst. He practiced in Beirut, Lebanon, and currently practices in Dubai. Mohamed also holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Ljubljana. We have another PhD student from Ljubljana. I don't know if you met, but the world is a small place. And most importantly, Mohamed's book, tentatively, or maybe not so tentatively any longer, titled The End of Analysis, is forthcoming with Palgrave. Let me just encourage you to read the book when it will be out. I'm speaking very honestly. It's one of the books I read over the last few years in the Lacanian field I found most interesting. I enthusiastically supported the publication of this book, and I think it's a rare and very successful intervention that manages to do almost the impossible, as we were saying earlier, that is to say, filling the gap between psychoanalytic practice, the clinic, however you want to put it, and theory, high theory. You can see Mohamed as a philosopher even in the book. So I like those two voices, which is one voice. Today, Mohamed will be presenting some material which is related to the book, The End of Analysis. The title of his presentation is The Perversion of Perversion, or there were two variants, Neurosis, the Perversion of Perversion. Mohamed's presentation, which revolves around ideas drawn from Lacan's seminar 10, of course, on anxiety, is also meant for us to close our year-long reading group on seminar 10. Just to give you some more context, obviously, we didn't make it through the entire seminar, but I think we reached lesson 14, right? 13 or 14.
Until what in the study edition is the last section. So the last 8 lessons were 9.
Yeah. So we did quite well. We didn't finish. We didn't end the seminar, but we read it quite carefully as a group. So I think Mohamed will be speaking for about 50 minutes, following which we will have an open Q&A session. And without further ado, I give the floor to Mohamed, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thanks to you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for hosting me. I'm very grateful for that. Well, since we're going to meet in the premise of seminar 10, like this is our encounter, I will try to walk you through a certain trajectory which I took in this thesis, which then became a book, which places seminar 10 somehow in the middle of 2 other texts, which are Analysis Terminable and Interminable, and the Subversion of the subject. So I will very briefly introduce Analysis Terminable and Interminable, then delve into how seminar 10 constituted a kind of opening to answer the question of Analysis Terminable and Interminable, and how the subversion of the subject was kind of a moment of formalization of what came in seminar 10. Well, to introduce Analysis Terminable, it's a historical debate. And it so happened that this historical debate occurred between an analyst and an analyst, 2 theorists, it's Ferenczi and Freud. And somehow we could say that this debate is not only a debate that occurs between Freud and Ferenczi. Analysis starts when someone comes to see an analyst. It starts on this question: what is the end? What is the end for the analysis that has been there all along and which now is being given a space, a particular space, which is now being appointed to a certain figure that represents this other. I cannot really distinguish between this theoretical debate and the course of an analysis. It's concomitantly present. Ferenczi publishes the first article, the first argument in the problem of the end of analysis. And his main theory, or his main concept of the end of analysis, is the concept of mourning, which he takes from Freud. Yet within this idea of mourning, there is a kind of supposition that analysis must function as therapy, as a psychotherapy, or even to push it further as a psychology. And somehow Freud's answer in Analysis Terminable is basically pointing out that, well, mourning is rather more a tactic in analysis, but it cannot be a guiding principle. So basically, the whole argument proceeds in the direction that mourning cannot really bring an end to analysis. It's not as beautiful as that. It's not as therapeutic as that. And basically what awaits the analyst in the end is some state of melancholia, which then with Lacan has been formalized into subjective destitution. So here we have already like the rules of the game. If mourning could work, there would be no need for subjective destitution. Even more, this is like a big problem I had, because as I was intending to answer this question, there are so many Lacanian theorists who kind of kept this link or this confusion between the theory of mourning of Ferenczi and subjective destitution. And basically I found that I had to fight with a lot of people, to kind of distinguish those two. To summarize Freud's argument, it's just 5 points. First, in order to affirm again against Ferenczi's argument that places psychoanalysis as a psychology or a therapy, for Freud to defend it as a meta-psychology, he has to prove first that the drive is a negation, while Ferenczi sustained the idea that the drive is a search for pleasure, primary pleasure. So Freud proceeds by demonstrating how actually the drive is what goes beyond pleasure. It's a negation of pleasure. And therefore, the difference between the problem as posed by Ferenczi and the problem as posed by Freud is that Ferenczi, by supposing that the drive is a seeking of pleasure, he takes the problem to be a problem of oppression, although he disguises it with an allure of alienation, but basically speaking about oppression. While Freud is responding by that, it is not a problem of oppression, it is alienation. Therefore, emancipation, let's call it, will have to proceed through a symptom. There is no cure in this sense. It cannot be a mourning that cures a certain loss. And the whole argument of Freud points in the direction of that mourning concerns the partial object, which then later on with Lacan, Seminar 10, we will see, is the image of the object. Within this reasoning, Freud affirms that, well, Ferenczi is kind of wishing quite a lot or demanding quite a lot by expecting the analysand to accept castration, and that castration cannot be accepted given that castration and desire are one. On top of that, Freud also articulates demand and transference, which Ferenczi reads as a kind of attachment, as a kind of alienation to the other. What Freud reads in demand throughout this argument in Analysis Terminable is that demand is the demand of the other's lack, which will be then formalized in Seminar 10. And therefore, that transference is already a separation. So wherever there is this discourse about the liquidation of transference, somehow Freud points us in the direction that this is actually an answer to a false problem. It is not transference that is the problem. Transference is an intended solution. This whole statement that Freud does in this work has been so misunderstood, has been interpreted in so many ways, kind of sided with Ferenczi in a way, and where the most common reading is that Freud is attesting that analysis fails. It's a failure of analysis, and somehow they held Freud kind of responsible for this failure. While in fact, if we follow this argument, we'd find that Freud is calling for a revision of the concept of neurosis. And therefore, mourning is only good for the pervert. After Analysis Terminable, Freud delves into perversion. And continues on this path of this distinction between neurosis and perversion. But to crystallize a little bit the main axiom that joins Analysis Terminable to Seminar 10 is that if castration cannot be accepted, then and if it is only accepted in perversion, then what is neurosis? Have we not addressed it under the influence of perversion? Have we not addressed it before as if it were a perversion? And this is where the point, this relation between neurosis and perversion becomes very important, as if one has to work with both of them in order to distinguish one from the other. And this is practically what Lacan does in one big part of Seminar 10. So I will use here a little bit Roberto Harari's term in which he describes Seminar 10. He calls it a kind of Lacan's rescuing of castration from the complex. The whole point that Lacan works through by conceptualizing anxiety and the object A is basically the difference between castration and the castration complex. So to depart again from the last point in Freud, Freud ends Analysis Terminable on the idea that the repudiation of femininity is a bedrock of subjectivity. There is no beyond it. And of course, by the repudiation of femininity, he means the repudiation of lack, which contradicts a very widespread idea, especially where I studied, in this clinical psychology realm, that actually the neurotic is the only to accept castration. While, in fact, where Freud got a little close to that, to this relation of the neurotic to castration, is where he spoke about the neurotic's acknowledgement of castration or recognition, never acceptance, which he immediately assigned to repression. So in a way, repression plays itself as acknowledgement, acknowledgement of castration. And he opposed this to the splitting of the ego in the pervert between disavowal and acknowledgement of castration, and the psychotic's complete disavowal of castration. It's not this simple idea that the neurotic cannot lack the phallus, but mostly that there is no without of desire, in as much as desire and castration are one, other than anxiety. So somehow this sets the framework for the neurotic, and the framework in which repetition operates, it's either desire or anxiety. One more element before we get to Seminar 10 is when actually did Freud give or associate castration with acceptance? Where did he really speak of accepting castration? And it was really fabulous. The only place where he speaks of accepting castration is where he speaks about the pervert. Where he speaks of, I quote, masochistic fantasies which were wholly derived from a wish to accept castration. So even there it is a wish, even in perversion. And this comes in a 17th century demonological neurosis in 1923. Why is it that the pervert accepts castration, or is the only to accept castration? It's precisely because castration turns his jouissance into the others, and it is as other that he enjoys. So basically, the real foundation of perversion is this preservation of this other as pure enjoyment, rather than when we speak about the neurotic, it's much more preserving the other as lacking enjoyment. With all the talk about perversion, you can see how many books there are, how many notions are invented about narcissists, about toxic relations. About, if we hear all around us, it's all speaking about perversion all the time, except that the real perverted stance or position is precisely to be adopting those notions to define a certain perversion that is outside. So the real perverse position is actually in this tyranny against perversion, this constant defining of perversion everywhere, except in perversion itself, which is this judgment, this legislation of punishment. And it is in this sense that there is a kind of bluff in accepting castration, because it is as other that he's enjoying it. He's enjoying it as effect of the legislative act. In Seminar 10, Lacan explains this malfunctioning of jouissance in perversion in the following quote. I will read it for you. I quote. It's on page 150 in Seminar on Anxiety. If we know something now about the pervert, it is that what appears from the outside to be an unbounded satisfaction is actually a defense and an implementation of a law, in as much as it curbs, suspends, and halts the subject on the path to jouissance. For the perverts, the will to jouissance is, as for anyone else, a will that fails, that encounters its own limit, its own reining in. In the very exercise of desire, the pervert doesn't know what jouissance he is serving in exercising his activity. It is not in any case in the service of his own jouissance. End of quote. So the whole emphasis here is that if there is a castration that the pervert disavows, where the disavowal is the other's castration. So basically, although he accepts his castration, the pervert, in the service of the other's enjoyment, the real castration, which is the castration of the other, the lack in the other, is the one that he disavows. So, in other words, wherever there is a perverse stance or a perverse position, there is a pure enjoyment. While the neurotic position is always revolving around another that must lack in some way. Now I will use a little bit Joëlle Dor's Structure and Perversion, her book on Structure and Perversion, just as a little junction between this initial exploration of perversion. Joëlle Dor, I quote, states that, I quote, "The lacking mother desires the father only because he is not without a phallus, as opposed to her desiring sexual difference." So in a way, the whole matter of desire for the pervert revolves around the phallus as if it was really the object, as if it was all there is in desire. The whole Oedipal terminology that Freud used to use for the neurotic, so wherever he speaks of the Oedipal complex, he supposes that the object of desire, or he supposes that there is an object of desire rather than an object cause of desire, and that it is a phallus. In this terminology, castration's only definition is a horror, which is an imaginary castration, whose very function is actually not the castration of the subject, but rather the exchange of the object, in the sense that if castration means that the other has taken the phallus from me, then it is not really a castration, it is an exchange, since this object has been positivized in the other. And this is somehow the real deal in this Oedipal scenario of castration. So it's strictly a bloody exchange of the phallus, which actually plays in preserving it. And this is precisely what allows us to say that for the pervert and this, taking this matrix of the Oedipus complex, for the pervert, castration itself, since it is an exchange of the object, it is its positivization in the other, castration itself is a fantasy. So this is a point that is quite different from this departure that somehow fantasy is what goes against castration. Fantasy is what goes as a kind of compensation of the lack of the object, which is always this lack of the partial object. But here with Lacan, the whole story would be reverted into that the lack of the object is the object itself. And therefore, this castration of the Oedipal complex is itself the fantasy, is itself the production of the phallus. Freud approached neurosis using a theory about perversion. If the Oedipus complex is basically what there is in perversion, then this whole association of the Oedipal complex to neurosis kind of Freud being confused or confusing neurosis and perversion. And this is a real struggle because indeed, I mean, when the neurotic comes to analysis, the whole struggle he lays out and the whole struggle he tries to work through is basically his entrapment in perversion. It's not only in perversion that there is perversion, but also in neurosis. And somehow the working through that happens in analysis for the neurotic is basically to subtract himself from perversion, or subvert himself as a subject out of perversion. And here I would just give a little indication about the title of Subversion of the subject. I'd like you just to think about it, perhaps a subversion of the subject which comes to replace perversion of the subject. What we get to in this reasoning is that the Oedipal complex serves as a perverse fantasy. It's the foundation of perversion. And what Lacan does with that in Seminar 10 is very interesting. He takes perversion as, you can see at every critical moment in Seminar 10, he brings in the pervert. It's fascinating. And this is really very new for demonstrations that are attached to demonstrations that occur within the clinical domain. Generally, perversion is always brought alone, and neurosis is explored as an entity on its own. So there is this pervert with the Oedipal complex, which is the very structure of fantasy for everyone. But then the neurotic has to distinguish himself from the pervert by something else. There is something in neurosis that goes beyond the Oedipal complex. And how he works through this distinction is by pointing at the fact that the pervert is the only to implement fantasy fully, while the neurotic's use of perverse fantasy always includes its failure. He always makes sure that fantasy fails. And when it does succeed, when it is close to success, let us say, when there is this other enjoying, this move by Lacan is of considering perversion as first criterion of subjectivation, out of which comes the second, which is neurosis. It opposes a very widespread belief that perversion is a sort of non-access to identification as a resolution of the Oedipal complex. This is a very classical topic, which is very much used, especially by Orthodox Freudianism, as much as by Ferencianism, Kleinism, and so on. And if we depart again from the fact that the Oedipal complex is a modality of preserving the phallus, of actually positivizing it, positivizing the loss. If we depart from the fact that it is this castration of the Oedipus complex is a fantasy itself. So against this widespread belief that posits that perversion is a non-access to identification, we may say here that actually identification as a resolution of the complex is actually a crystallization of perversion and a non-access to neurosis. So to add to this first axiom, which Freud advanced in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, where he says, or he does not say it, but he indicates it, that mourning is only good for the pervert, we may add now that not only mourning is only good for the pervert, but also identification. This rift there is between the pervert and the neurotic, which is at the level of the fact that the pervert has an object of desire, while the neurotic has an object cause of desire. It's not the phallus, it's not the image of the object, it's the lack of it, which is the lack in the other. And let us take into account the fact that this is precisely where Lacan puts all his focus. And this is precisely where he intends to rescue castration from the complex, using the pervert as a witness on the neurotic's deception, given that the neurotic shows a wish for the phallus, except that the moment he has it, it's anxiety. Or the moment he presents it to the other or represents it to the other, it is anxiety. So this is where Lacan shows that what neurosis is after is the lack of the phallus, and that the phallus for neurosis is a bluff. And compared to the neurotic's bluff, the pervert is quite truthful. He really wants a phallus. He's very loyal and loyal to the other. So about this intertwining of perversion and neurosis and this extraction that Lacan does, I think 3 passages from Seminar 10 could guide us to see how he distinguishes them progressively. Except that the first passage, he's going to give it to us in an inverse form. Let's read it together. I quote, it's on page 49. I quote, "For the pervert, things are, if I may say so, in the right place. The A is right where the subject can see it, and the capital S is in its place. This is why one can say that the perverse subject, whilst remaining oblivious to the way this functions, offers himself loyally to the other's jouissance. Only we'd never have known anything about it had it not been for the neurotics, for whom the fantasy doesn't possess at all the same function. The neurotic is the one who reveals the fantasy in its structure because of what he makes of it, but also, at the same time, through what he makes of it, he cons you like he cons everyone." Well, here he's already introducing the idea that the pervert uses fantasy till the end, while the neurotic uses it in a way as a cover for lack. I quote, "Neurotics have perverse fantasies, and analysts have been racking their brains for a good while wondering what this means. At any rate, one can very well see that it's not the same thing as perversion, that it doesn't function in the same way, and the whole mix-up is produced, questions mount up, and people wonder, for example, whether a perversion is really a perversion. In other words, whether, perchance, it might not be functioning as does the fantasy for the neurotic." So basically, Lacan is questioning neurosis by perversion. Here, things have been reversed. It's basically the pervert that plays the role of the indicator. And the whole point is to show how the neurotic's use of fantasy differs from the pervert by the fact that he makes fantasy fail. And this gets completed by this third paragraph, which I would read. I quote, "It's striking that the fantasy the neurotic makes use of, which he organizes at the very moment he uses it, is precisely what serves him best in defending himself against anxiety and keeping a lid on it. This object A that the neurotic makes himself into in his fantasy becomes him much like gaiters do a rabbit. That's why the neurotic never makes much of his fantasy, as opposed to the pervert. It succeeds in defending him against anxiety precisely to the extent that it's a postiche." So the whole point here is that in neurosis, there is a kind of perverted use of perverse fantasy. And it is in this sense that we may call neurosis a perversion of perversion. And in this idea of perversion of perversion, there is, rather than a linear passage from perversion to neurosis, there is a break. There's something that is returned, that is perverted again. For where the pervert offers himself as the other's object, the neurotic only offers himself as a postiche. And wherever the other becomes another of enjoyment, it's anxiety that strikes again. This, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that this basically breaks this linearity of and the aspirations in a linear psychic development. As for instance, for all the time where perversion was considered as a perversion of neurosis. And here, with Lacan's work, he's advancing neurosis itself as perversion of perversion. Neurosis itself as a second criterion. Neurosis as extractable from perversion. I mean, the neurotic is one step further than the complex. It's not in a resolution of the complex as said earlier. It's through a break with the complex that neurosis starts to be accessible. And furthermore, the real struggle of the neurotic, if we want to discuss this idea of identification as resolution of the complex, the whole struggle of the neurotic is precisely how to not allow this identification to be complete. So how to maintain this separation or this possibility of separation. This whole work on the function of anxiety as a signal of that the subject's lax jouissance has become the other's, that it is no longer lacking in the other. And that basically Heim has become unheim. So in a way, to summarize all that, and especially the last point, we may say that Lacan advances in the direction where the unheimlich signals that alienation to the signifier has become complete, alienation to the other has become complete, and that no separation is possible anymore. Hence, intervention of anxiety. And here, I mean, there are passages that are very important, but here he challenges another very widespread idea, which is this separation anxiety. Basically, what he tells us through all this demonstration is that there is no separation anxiety, there is alienation anxiety. There is anxiety when separation has become impossible. It's no longer the absence of the other that is trigger of anxiety. It's no longer the other's lack, but rather the reverse is over-presence. This is what I'd like to take from Seminar 10. And if you don't mind, I would suggest to proceed in a small junction and then to the subversion of the subject. Okay, here I'm gonna make two jumps without a lot of explanation because this is gonna take a lot of time. It's a whole thing. But we need two axioms, which I'm just gonna summarize very, very briefly. First, there is Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety, which Lacan refers to throughout Seminar 10. Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety as preceding desire. And this departs from Kierkegaard's work on spirit not being in itself, but being only spirit for itself, which then requires it to present itself for itself through the immediacy of anxiety. To present itself as possibility of itself through anxiety. And what he arrives at through this demonstration is that anxiety, the first anxiety, which he calls objective dread, precedes prohibition and desire. Let me summarize this part. This whole part about anxiety preceding desire in Kierkegaard is important for us in as much as the real is itself incomplete and requires to be mediated. It's no longer the idea that prohibition is what brings the symbolic, but rather the reverse. It's actually the necessity within the real for it to be for itself, necessity within the lack of the real, which requires it to be presented for itself as a possibility, which then requires prohibition. And this is Kierkegaard's argument.
Maybe the question, I'm sorry if I interject. I guess like this is Kierkegaard, but then the question is, does Lacan agree with Kierkegaard here? Because it's a tricky issue, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what Lacan does out of this is the whole scheme of subjectivation. Like, of course, in Kierkegaard, there is nothing, the nothing of spirit, which is then reflected by anxiety for itself and projected on a name, prohibition. And then there is desire. Somehow what Lacan does in this scheme of or table of subjectivation is that he he objects to Kierkegaard on one point, which is that this nothing, this initial state is not there. It's something which only becomes possible through anxiety. So in a way, somehow Lacan let us say corrects this reasoning and makes it a little more dialectical, in the sense that there is no prior state to the dialectic. I mean, this initial state is only a fact of the dialectic itself. It comes afterwards. This is a first axiom, which is the incompleteness of the real. Let's just retain it, which Lacan takes from Kierkegaard or develops out of Kierkegaard, let's say. The second axiom is also departing from Kierkegaard and departing from Kierkegaard's remark that if Adam was ignorant, it cannot be God that voiced out prohibition to him. Because how would he understand it? How would God be God then? So, given that it is anxiety that formed prohibition and that Adam couldn't have uttered it if it was voiced out by God, Kierkegaard postulates that Adam was speaking since the beginning. He could name things, but it is this anxiety which posited this or projected this possibility of spirit in a name, which then became a prohibition. Okay, and this is why is this important for us? It's important for us just as a junction to Lacan's debate with Lévi-Strauss on the status or the nature of S1, the first signifier, because for Lévi-Strauss and for structuralism, the other is a structure, and the first signifier, departing from his own reading of Mauss on mana, the first signifier is a zero signifier. This is the formalization that Lévi-Strauss makes of Marcel Mauss' mana. Somehow departing from this axiom of Kierkegaard, Lacan enters this debate with Lévi-Strauss also, which occurs not in Seminar 10, but in the Subversion of the Subject. He enters this debate to affirm that there is no zero symbol, there is no zero signifier. But S1 is not zero signifier, but the name of a zero signifier. The name of the lack of a zero signifier. Sorry. So those 2 points are important for us now, because in the Subversion of the Subject, we're going to see somehow Lacan operating in the other direction. Like if we saw him distinguishing the neurotic from the pervert, if we saw him in Seminar 10 telling us why the neurotic is not a pervert, in the Subversion of the Subject, he's going to do quite the reverse. He's going to tell us, well, why the neurotic is a pervert, or why does the neurotic have something to do with perversion as well. One essential element about the Subversion of the Subject is that in this text, this subversion of the subject doesn't occur without the subversion of the other. It's only through subverting the other into desire that he manages to subvert the subject. And those two axioms that we just listed from Kierkegaard are essential for us in this, because they point to the incompleteness of the real and the incompleteness of the symbolic. The first axiom is the incompleteness of the real in anxiety preceding desire. The second axiom is the incompleteness of the symbolic, which is the fact that the first signifier is the name of the lack of a zero symbol. So in the subversion of the subject, of course, not from the beginning, but at some point in the text, comes the question, what is the other? What is it reducible to? Does it exist? Is it one? And if the other was a structure, the question is quite simple. It is one. But in Subversion of the Subject, Lacan introduces the other as a gap, as desire, as sacredness, as authority, which is itself a possibility of the subject himself. Which brings us back to the question that Kierkegaard somehow takes us toward or leads us to, is what else could have barred the subject from jouissance than the very possibility of this jouissance? And this is where the possibility of possibility comes in. Like, the symbolic gets all of its consistency from the real. It is only for representing this jouissance that the other gains this authority, or that the other steps in by this prohibition and represents this authority that he represents. The real function of the name of the Father is not to bar any jouissance for the subject, but basically to bar jouissance for the other, to bar the other from jouissance. Like, the name of the Father is the name of lacking the other. I will quote a passage which makes this junction between incompleteness of the real and incompleteness of the symbolic. I quote, this is écrit Subversion of the Subject, page 694. I quote, "Is this jouissance the lack of which makes the other inconsistent mine?" The subject. "Experience proved that it is usually forbidden me, not only due to bad societal arrangements, but because the other is to blame. If he was to exist, that is, but since he doesn't exist, all that's left for me is to place the blame on I, that is, to believe in what experience leads us all to, Freud at the head of the list, original sin." What comes in this passage are three axioms. First, that jouissance is prohibited to whoever speaks. It can only be said between the lines. I quote Lacan. So basically, that jouissance is not barred by any bad societal arrangements, but it's a fact of speech, first. So to go back to Kierkegaard, it is not prohibition that bars jouissance, it is basically the incompleteness of jouissance which requires it to be a possibility, its own possibility, which creates prohibition itself. So this is the first axiom. Second axiom is that given that this jouissance presents itself as its possibility in the other, it gives its consistency to the other, and with it the blame for its loss. And third axiom, but since the other doesn't exist, or is still desire, it's not a structure, the blame is reverted on the subject in the form of original sin, whose function is to turn the lack of jouissance into the sacrifice that ensures its promise. In a way, it's only with the original sin that there is the promise of the heavens, that there is the promise of the return. So, to summarize those three actions, there are, in a way, two moments. First, there is the loss of jouissance as such, which was never there, but only occurs by this loss. So first, there is this hypothetical loss of jouissance as such in its naming by S1, the first signifier. And second, there is the restitution of jouissance as missing signifier by its inscription through the castration. So in other words, what Lacan formalizes here is two castrations. The first castration, which occurs in S1, which is the other's castration, the other as lack, the other as gap, as desire. And the second is the castration of the complex, which compensates this first castration by phi. So there is the other as desire. This is the first castration. The second castration of the complex comes in as what produces the phallus, the object, which is what the other desires. But the whole deduction that he makes out of those two axioms is that if phallus restitutes any lost jouissance, it's not that of the subject. Basically, it's that of the other. Because it is already as other that jouissance arrives. This is like the difference between Lacan and Kierkegaard. What I'd like to deduce out of this reasoning is that the whole problem of fantasy is not just bypassing the incompleteness of the symbolic. It's not just as the pervert would like it to be, an ultimate sacrifice and another that is a pure enjoyment. But basically, it is a bypassing of the incompleteness of the symbolic to counter the incompleteness of the real. I mean, where this becomes very tangible is, for instance, when we take the problem of the end of analysis, as in many discussions, to be the problem of transference, or the problem of the castration complex. For instance, the problem of transference, as it is laid out generally, posits that the whole the exit from the problem of analysis is by this disillusion of the other, or disidealization of the other. Although it is not really the other that is at stake, but jouissance that he represents, the jouissance that gives him consistency. The whole point, or the whole problem of the end of analysis, is neither in this, let us say, the unbeing of the subject supposed to know, which is a solution brought to transference, nor in any acceptance of the castration complex. It's rather more in this unlocking of the real as bar to itself. unlocking of the real as being itself its own limit. How about we stop there? Yeah.
No. I mean, go on, please.
No, actually, I mean, I skipped a couple of parts, but I think it's quite okay. We can stop there. No.
Okay, maybe you can add stuff in conversation, answering questions. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mohamed.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you.
I just asked quite literally this time, a very simple question, which is could you specify exactly what you mean by the incompleteness of the real? Because a definition would be nice, yeah.
Actually, you're very right to ask this question. This is basically the part I skipped. Well, okay. The incompleteness of the real is precisely what Freud reveals in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that there is in enjoyment a very problem within enjoyment itself, which is the fact that pleasure is itself its barrier. By the time jouissance becomes accessible, it turns into pleasure. And then there is this surplus enjoyment that is searched beyond pleasure. The very success of enjoyment is its failure. And in this sense, the real is incomplete given its immediacy. So there is this briefty of any erotic experience, which makes the real incomplete, which makes always jouissance somewhere else to search for, beyond pleasure, which is itself what requires the symbolic and what requires prohibition. Because if this real, given its incompleteness, must always be presented as a possibility, something to search for, how can it be presented as a possibility if not through prohibition?
Sorry,
Yeah, please go.
just a quick follow-up. I don't quite understand why this would make the real incomplete. The symbolic I understand entirely. I mean, I see that you're implicitly referring to the argument from Seminar 7, right? About the pleasure principle effectively being the principle of the symbolic, and that there is some limit and there's some piece of the real which is cordoned off, which suffers from the signifier and so forth, that being dusting and the right. But let me put it this way. If we're going to save that argument from being ridiculous, then we should at least say that that piece of the real, right, is not the real. I mean, yeah.
I mean, this is a crucial, I mean, Paris, I think, like, brought in perhaps the most difficult issue. That's the first question. But if I can mediate, because I had a very similar question, which would have asked, like, really at the end, because there's much more before that in your presentation. But if we're trying to mediate, and then there's Peter raising his hand, but what do you call the incompleteness of the real? Is it the same as saying the incompleteness of the real of the symbolic, or is it not? Or the other way to put it would be the incompleteness of the real for you. Is it the same as Lacan saying structure is the real? Because that would be a mediation from my perspective, and I suspect also Paris's. Whereas, at least in philosophical terms, and of course, you know, you work with Mladen and the Slovenians, so I understand there's another stance there. But positing the incompleteness of the real, which is present in Lacan, but in some places only, and I would say Seminar 7 and the myth of the Lamella. So, in a way, is the incomplete just to be a bit too philosophical, but is the incompleteness of the real for you a matter of being, or is it a matter of structure? Because philosophically, this is huge in terms of how you read everything else you said and Lacan, right? Because I guess here the tendency would be to say that structure is the real, so one can talk about the incompleteness of the real, but it's a bit tautological because it is the incompleteness of the symbolic after all. So the question would be, does anxiety precede desire, or will have anxiety preceded desire only retrospectively? Or even more psychoanalytically, I mean, is the privation of the mother, which is the desire, pure immediate of the mother, really the beginning as, ontogenesis? Because that would lead you to a strong understanding of the incompleteness of the real.
I think that this is a question I must think about thoroughly. I haven't thought about it before. If it is the incompleteness of the real, or if it is the incompleteness of the real of the symbolic. And I think this is certainly a question I'd like to investigate more.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. So my sense of this, so I just want to comment on this and see if this makes sense. I don't think of the real as structure. And what I'm thinking of, so I think it's more ontogenetic, if I've understood this conversation right. And what I'm thinking of is if you jump ahead to the Boromir knot later on in seminar, is it 22 or something? His notion there is that the rings hold together by being interconnected. And therefore, the incompleteness of the symbolic needs the other rings to be incomplete as well. So there is an incompleteness in the real, and there's also, and this was the question I was going to ask, I don't have a problem with the notion of incompleteness of the symbolic and incompleteness of the real, but what I wasn't hearing in the talk was, how am I to make sense of the incompleteness of the imaginary? Because all three of them are essentially incomplete. They all arise with the formation of the subject. The real's not out there. That's the lesson the Boromir knot. And the other thing I would say is, when you started talking about how this incompleteness relates to the name of the father, I was expecting you to go on to talk about how Lacan shifts from talking about the name of the father to the names of the father, because this lack and incompleteness has come more centrally into the whole of the formation of this RSI nexus of the subject, rather than just being an incompleteness which is sort of imported through the symbolic. So it is also tied in again with, how do we make sense of the incompleteness of the imaginary?
What I can think of is, I don't see the imaginary as being a completely separate structure than the symbolic. I tend to think of first the symbolic being a structure, yet an unstable structure, with moments where it is the symbolic itself which is taken by the imaginary. Wherever we speak about the subject of enunciation, its correlative is the lacking other. When we speak about the subject of the enounced, it is the full other. I tend to think about imaginary and symbolic as alternation, rather than the imaginary itself as a separate structure than the symbolic.
Let me quickly jump in. I mean, Perhaps this is a naive answer to Peter's question, which is a difficult one. I agree with Mohamed. But what about saying that incompleteness of the imaginary is precisely what doesn't work at the level of the species, Homo sapiens sapiens? That is to say, you know, the early Lacan, that the fact that the Gestalt identification is always an alienating identification. So that is, if you take at least that early Lacan, a way in which the imaginary is complete, or, I mean, we have some working on these issues, the more naive even way of saying that the imaginary is complete is precisely the fact that the gaze is never absent from what you see, right? I mean, these are two naive answers to Peter's very difficult question, but A, if images operate already at the level of biology, you follow Lacan, and there's some too much Heidegger there, but let's put it aside, you know, one can say that it's because of the imaginary incompleteness that something dialectically happens that will have been the symbolic, right? And B, as a adult post-Oedipal non-psychotic subject, you know, I don't see it all. I cannot see my entire body. I cannot see behind me. And that is like quite intuitive way, I would say, of saying the imaginary is incomplete. I don't have a full vision.
I mean, if you want my view, I think what you're saying about how the sense of the completeness of the Gestalt is an illusion that is created by the brain out of our embodied experience of being in the world is, you know, so we have an illusion of completeness in something that has to be inherently incomplete. I think all three of these have to be incomplete, because otherwise there's no way of changing over time the way that you're holding them. So I think what Mohamed's saying is really interesting about the incompleteness of the symbolic, the incompleteness of the real. It's not just an incompleteness brought in from the symbolic, but I also think it's an incompleteness in the imaginary that is sort of, it's more radical, and that's what J.R. is pointing to, this radical incompleteness, which is a condition of possibility of the formation of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. And then that enables the sorts of ways of being in the world, which then enable language and social symbolics to become imbricated into the subjectivity. But that would be my take on it. I'm not sure if that's making sense or resonating with other people or not.
I do have a question about perversion, funnily enough, I know. And it's about some maybe potential clinical implications, if I understand your argument correctly. But nonetheless, I think one thing that has always struck me odd about Lacanian psychoanalysis after Lacan, but also in the wake of, well, most importantly, what he says in Seminar 10, is the constant identification of homosexual attachment as always perversion. I think it's no doubt that it has, in some respects, a function of perversion in some instances, but I've always found it confusing and theoretically suspect that homosexual attachment would itself always be perversion, and not in some instances according with, say, the structure of the neurotic fantasy. I think Lacan gives indications in Seminar 10 especially that some instances of homosexual attachment could be regarded as a way of fantasizing castration in a way that's more in accord with neurosis, rather than in a way that is always in accord with the pervert's fantasy. So my question is, if your analysis and your repositioning of the terms of the debate here and the terms of the structures of both the pervert's fantasy and the neurotic's fantasy sort of allow us to realize what I think is maybe a more interesting and ultimately more theoretically sound position that homosexual attachment isn't necessarily always a part of the pervert's fantasy or necessarily a sign of a perverse speech series in analysis. So yes, I'm wondering if you've thought at all about this clinical as well as theoretical question.
Well, about this relation of homosexuality to perversion, it requires from us to first not only rely on this outline of perversion which we have now, but it leads me to an even more critical question of who's the pervert, you know? Because although in this unfolding of seminar 10, for instance, we have more clarity about the perverse position. But Lacan's dealing with not only the perverse position, but the pervert himself as subject is very particular, to the point of, even if you take, for instance, I can't remember where exactly in the seminar, when he speaks about masochism and this function of the ejectum, like the masochist, how he reduces himself to an object that is thrown away, and it's only by that he's ejected from the other. Take this example. Well, if this is the case of the pervert, it is not a pervert. You know, because being ejected from the other is basically installing lack again in the other. So there is something very particular about Lacan's treatment of perversion. The neurotic, it's kind of more clear, but the pervert, I honestly, all this reason leads me to a far bigger question, which is, who the hell is the pervert? You know, and I find it quite amazing how easy it is for clinicians to speak about perverts. On the other hand, if we are to suppose that this pervert is a subject, we may say that analysts have never seen him, in the sense that if it is analysis, it is interpretation, scansion, and so on, pervert is mostly the one who never comes back. And you wouldn't know if that is actually pervert or a neurotic who has a perverse function. This makes the pervert far more difficult to define as a subject. And it opens the realm of neurosis to so many different positions, of which many were supposed to be perversion. In what I can think of, there are two lines in which the relation of homosexuality to perversion may be read. One of them is this relation to the similar, to the semblable, and so on, which may lead to a reading of homosexuality as perversion. But there is another reading as well, where actually sexuality is de facto homosexuality. Even when it is heterosexuality, it is still homosexuality. And I tend to view things rather more on this side. That even in the most heterosexual kind of desire, it is still homosexual. And in that sense, fantasy is de facto perverse.
Yes, thank you very much. I see exactly what you mean with that further critical question, and it's one that has come up in my study of seminar 10 as well, is like, really, who is this pervert? Then I think your second answer about the sort of implied's not quite the strongest word here, but implied homosexuality of every attachment, in a sense, accords with that view. Well, who have we ever really seen a pervert, or have we not actually just seen in moments instantiations of the perverse fantasy coming out in certain speech series? So anyways,
I totally agree with this framing of things. I tell you, I as a practitioner have no idea who is the pervert. And the more I work on this topic, the more the neurotic becomes clear and the more the pervert becomes. I tend to think that it is a logical necessity.
But wouldn't here, like, the clinic confirm the way in which you've read theoretically perversion? That is to say, if we take, and I'm simplifying your really subtle and beautiful argument, reading Lacan beyond Lacan and Freud beyond Freud, if you take the ground zero subjectivity awful expression as being somehow perversion, and then neurosis is, simplification of your beautiful argument, a kind of subset of perversion, a perversion of perversion. Then in a sense, well, and this goes back to the second part of the answer you gave to Holden, the ground zero subjectivation is what Lacan calls in seminar 20, perversion, and he says, if you are located on the side of men, that is to say, you abide by fantasy, you are pervert. So you see my point. Like, then the question is, the difficult question for you would be clinical perversion. Like, let's dare to say pathological perversion. Where is it? But then it becomes easy, right? If you have, I guess, an analysant who is actually undressing in front of children, etc., etc. Okay, that's like a kind of non-neuropathology, but a pathological case of perversion. But in a sense, I guess you already answered your question. Like, I've never found a structural pervert in the clinic, because that is your theoretical argument. And I think it's the strong and right argument. Is to say the grounds, and supported by seminar 20 at least, like the ground zero of subjectivity. Then the question is, what about a woman, symbolically speaking? Because this would lead us to say that the only Homo sapiens qua subjectivized X, who is not somehow necessarily a pervert, is a woman. If you say that all subjects were on the side of men as logical sexuation are necessarily pervert somehow, they are apologies for the brutal neologism, they are somehow homo pervert by being, in terms of object choice, heterosexual, because this is Lacan's point, right? So object choice heterosexual, the sleeping with is not the question here in terms of homosexuality. Who you're sleeping with, the question is like structural.
That's a brilliant article.
How you sleep. Emily was saying how you sleep. That's a very nice one. No,
not who you sleep with.
No, who you sleep with, but how you sleep with.
Absolutely.
Ask the other question. I might ask a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was extremely illuminating with regard to the relation between structure and castration, among many other things. But You seem to suggest that there's an irreducibility following Lacan between castration and the castration complex. Really interesting. And I was wondering, I mean, you seem to suggest that this is already at work in Freud when you mentioned this sort of repudiation of femininity qua lac. And I was just wondering because, I mean, to make this distinction, I would assume that we would need a sort of robust theory of the objet a. But whether that's the case, I mean, open question, or whether you already see the sort of prehistory of the concept of the objet a in Freud, I guess with like dusting or blah, blah, blah. But I was hoping you could just elaborate on this point briefly.
Well, this is one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating while working on the subject. I'll tell you what I used to write to Mladen. I was reading Analysis Terminable and Interminable, and reading it quite closely. I spent 6 months in this text, literally. And at a certain point, I was emailing Mladen, telling him, Mladen, am I delirious? I mean, Freud is pointing at objet a. I mean, he's in his counter argument to Ferenczi, he's totally taking us in the direction of the fact that by the end of an analysis, the object and castration are one. You know, the object is the lack of the object. And the whole argument of Freud, how it basically crashes the whole foundation built on the Oedipus complex. He goes totally against all this foundation in this argument. Of course, it is not laid out very clearly, but it may be interpreted. I managed to interpret some of it, and I managed to consider even the objet a, which Lacan considers his only invention, even that to be a return to Freud. So I'm totally with you in this line. I see this is where I'm going, but I can tell you that it was very difficult to assume. You know, it was quite a difficult point. The argument against mourning and siding with melancholia and destitution later on, as formalized, is an indication to objet a. The reformulation of the drive as being a negation of pleasure is an indication of objet a. The compulsion to repeat, which he refers to, is an objet a, and the opening of his text, which starts on the symptom. Basically, he starts Analysis Terminable and Interminable by stating that, I mean, telling his fellow analysts, his disciples, and so on, make no mistake, whatever you do, it will be a symptom and it will function for some time. Let us not assume that anything has been cured. Everything that has been cured was kind of cured by a symptom which was produced, and it will function for a while. But of course, to go in this direction and to unfold it properly, I would need the whole chapter on Analysis Terminable, which is really very very detailed. But I'm totally for this hypothesis that even the objet a is a return to Freud, if not that it is the return to Freud par excellence.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a follow-up to that, but to Emily's question, because you said within your presentation that, I mean, it was just an aside, but that, okay, we can see very clearly legible the partial object in Freud's formulation of the end of analysis, which makes total sense. In particular, the distinction between melancholia and mourning being actually giving up on that, but the image of the ego, right, and so forth. And so you could call it almost egoical destitution, right, as opposed to subjective destitution, which is why subjective destitution is not mourning. But then your pivot was to say, okay, but in Seminar 10 at least, Lacan very clearly says that's not the object, that's the image of the object, right? So is this, and don't forget that in the Z schema earlier iterations, the place of the image of the object was in fact just awe. And then he had to revise that in order to, especially around 4 through 6, seminars 4 through 6, especially 6, to really say, no, there's something different going on, right? So I would push back a little bit and say on this, retrospection on Freud, and say that, well, yeah, in fact, there is a function that he does not put his finger on, and that's why, this sort of dichotomy that he formulates is not sufficient to approach something like subjective destitution, which, by the way, is a cliche term that I think is taken too far. But if it means anything, it's subjective destitution, not egoical destitution, like mourning. So I just want to ask if we can in fact distinguish, because if not, then I'm not sure exactly what progress has been made in Lacan on Freud.
Well, no. There's something, of course, Freud speaks about the partial object throughout Analysis Terminable and Interminable, and he never speaks about anything else as object than the partial object. This is clear, except that all the logical consequences of the ending of analysis, were it a partial object that was being mourned, that was being dealt with, he negates them all. So although he does not speak of any negativity except when he speaks of the drive as a drive to negate pleasure, but I see in his argument an indication of that something in the partial object does not work conceptually. Hence, the necessity of revising the concept of neurosis and the concept of the object.
I mean, the reason I maintain this is because I think that actually, if there's one very important conceptual move in Seminar 10, it's to distinguish what we might call the real imaginary from the imaginary real, something that we've talked about to some extent, where the image of the other, the pound of flesh, is very different from the damned spot, which is, the real point of incompleteness of the visual field.
I totally see your point. The only place where I see Freud pointing at it rather directly is where he speaks of the drive. Where he speaks of the drive and of negation, he's speaking about the pound of flesh, puissance, as a negative compared to the imaginary. So, but I certainly agree. I agree with your point that yes, it is not a complete move. It is not all laid out in Freud, and that indeed Lacan has introduced a break. In the objet.
Well, maybe like if one looks at what Lacan says in terms of Freud anticipating somehow up to a certain point objet bêtise, I think the only reference is in Seminar 4 when he speaks of Hans's horse, the black spot. And that, again, I mean, I don't like being a mediator, but I think like it would mediate your positions, because in a sense, there is already, according to Lacan, some objet art in Freud, but yes, following Paris, that is not really Lacan's yet objet art, because we are on the level 7 of the blind spot, or a bit more, but not the pound of flesh. I don't know why I'm again mediating that. This seems to be, you see, like exegetically saying, Lacan said, you know, like he doesn't call it like that. I don't remember the passage, but he says something like, you know, like this is like premonition of Freud, you know.
Can we really posit that there's an irreducibility of the castration complex and castration in Freud then, without the robust theory of objet, which was my concept?
No, it's a very good question, and I think like that's also the strength of Seminar 10 as we read it, and of Mohamed's interpretation. I mean, basically, the basic point, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are saying, and that Seminar 10, according to you, is saying, is that the castration of the complex is not castration.
Yes,
But I guess like that requires an articulated theory of Ujetitia.
yes.
But hence this last point, and maybe this is like also asking you, I find it personally more difficult to find in Freud.
Mhm.
That you know, like that the castration complex is not castration with a strong sense.
Or
It's probably.
Yeah, I mean, like we were, but please, and then we'll have to wrap it up, unfortunately, because
I
if
totally.
you have like, any more final comments, and then I'm sure we'll continue in another circumstance, like very soon or quite soon.
I'd love to.
Oh
Well,
my God. Sorry, there's
just-
no.
We have an alarm.
Okay. Okay. Bye.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. We keep in touch.